welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. I am Shogun, and we are going to be discussing Gnosticism. We're going to be discussing Gnosticism today, which is a very interesting topic and set of topics. We are going to talk about the Demiurge, Yaldabaoth, the Archons, Sophia, the True Man, and many other things. Before we do, please join us on the Roundtable Discord server and find our 250 plus podcast episodes on YouTube and BitChute, as well as hashtag RT Podcast channel on the Roundtable Discord server. That being said, welcome Krimsonraven, my friend. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Shogun?
I'm great. I am looking forward to this conversation and feeling great. Also, welcome Kashika. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. So this is a dialectical format podcast that can be thought of as a non-adversarial conversation version of a debate. So in a debate, you're trying to defeat your opponent's arguments and prove the validity of your own in an adversarial or competitive format. And we do those here, and I love doing those. And we've had lots of good ones in the past. But the dialectical format is like a conversation where two people are kicking a set of ideas back and forth in order to explore them without any contest involved. But even though it is non-adversarial, we're going to have Kashika here as a moderator, just to keep a rough eye on who's speaking for how long, because we're not going to follow the 2-minute format, so we can get into longer form discussion. Therefore, we'll have no time limit, but Kashika will just sort of be there to make sure that we're getting equal time approximately. And although it won't be necessary, to make sure it remains 100% amicable, because I admit me and Krimson have been, mostly me, I guess, being a little heated about our theological disputes. So I think this will be a valuable way to elaborate these ideas as well. So I thought the good way to approach this is to briefly give an account of the biblical narrative, very briefly, and then use that as a launching point for our exploration of Gnosticism, since you can't really understand one without understanding the other. So that being said, in the Christian narrative, you have God, the Heavenly Father, who is the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, of David, and of Jesus, and of Moses, etc. And you get the Old Testament, the New Testament. And then you have this adversarial figure called Satan, who in Christian theology controls the earth with his fallen angels after they attempted a rebellion against God, which failed, and they were cast down to earth until Jesus was sent from heaven to earth to break the power of Satan. In the future, Jesus will return and defeat Satan and cast out the fallen angels. That would be a very abbreviated version of Christian theology. Now, the Gnostic version is essentially very closely related and often very almost identically parallels the Christian narrative, but at other points inverts it completely or kind of seems to reverse it, and at other times it's just wildly different. But there's a core set of concepts that all have some parallel. So anything that's in Gnosticism generally has some parallel in the Bible and vice versa, but the reference points are shuffled or changed. So I want to systematically break this down. It's actually highly complicated and fascinating. And just as a bit of background, the Gnostic Gospels primarily come from the Nag Hammadi text. And in particular, we're going to be talking about one of the Nag Hammadi texts called The Origin of the Universe, I think it's called. What is it called?
On the Origin of the World.
Thank you. On the Origin of the World. And I will post that document, the full text thereof, in the general chat. If anybody wants to look at it, I highly recommend reading it. You can also find audio of it. So me and Krimson, he listened to it and I read it today, the full text, and then we've been kind of debating about it in DMs. So I'm just trying to find that document. But anyways, I'll just say this and then I'll hand over the mic. The concepts that we're going to talk about that are kind of core to Gnosticism are Sophia, the Demiurge, who is called Yaldabaoth and has other names like Samael, the Archons, the True Man, who seems to sort of parallel Jesus, I think, and other things. So that being said, maybe I can start by asking you a question. The narrative of the book begins with Sophia, essentially. So, I mean, why don't you start by giving us your TLDR of the whole document?
Okay. So on the specific one on the origin of the world that we're talking about, right at the very beginning, the first thing that it starts to talk about is that there was a thing before chaos, right? So in a lot of theological things, especially from like Jazzmatazz, who was mentioning the other day about how chaos it created like all things, right? But in the Gnostic perspective, immediately at the start of this specific document, it talks about how there was a thing before chaos, and and there was a thing that created chaos, and then therefore from chaos, within the realm that we live, all the other things, including our world, were created. So the thing from the Gnostic perspective that created chaos is this entity called Sophia. So Sophia is what's called an aeon. Aeons are like super higher dimensional beings that exist within a place called the pleroma, and the pleroma is like another dimension where just other aeons exist, like gods, as we would call them, or entities that are maybe not the infinite prime creator god, but like other more powerful gods, where Sophia specifically is the aeon that is essentially our entire galaxy. The Gnostics believe is a intelligent entity that is ruled by Sophia. And in their perspective, Sophia is essentially like the principle of the Divine Mother, or the mother that is the creator, at least of the worlds that we know. And she essentially represents herself over and over and over again, where she'll have like children and then be reborn through her own children into another form, into a lower dimension, but still also exists in the pleroma and in all the other spaces, because in a way she is either omnipresent or to a point where she is so multi-present that she is in a lot of places at one time. And that's the very beginning. It talks about how there was a thing before chaos. Now, in the narrative of this story, basically what had happened is Sophia was to make a child, but her husband, who was not there, and because he was not there, she ended up conceiving this child herself. So you could call it essentially a virgin birth. But ultimately, these beings, these aeons, are androgynous. They do not require a partner, but with the partner, they create better things, because then they have both sides of polarity in balance to make balanced things. So she created an imbalanced child, which is called Yaldabaoth. And Yaldabaoth is the demiurge, or essentially the blind god, which is what the word Samael, this is another word we've heard many times, especially regarding like demonology and things. But Samael means blind god. And so she created this, she basically masturbated, and in her orgasm created Ildabaoth. And then when Ildabaoth came into reality, he existed within a space that was separate from things. And in that space, nothing existed yet. He basically was created within his own space, but later, through a chain of events that are dictated in this specific document, the world ends up being created. But one of the main character that we're considering here is the demiurge, right? Yaldabaoth. And he essentially is this corrupt, chaotic, blind god. He's even referred to as an abortion, or like a mistake, like something that should have never been created. But because Sophia had created it, like any mother, even if you have a disabled child, you don't wish your child to die. So instead, she gave this abortion of a child who is basically half aeon and half chaotic abyss, and allowed it its space to create its things. Now, essentially, the world we live in today is the creation of Ildabaoth, because Ildabaoth is what created matter, the matter that we're made up of, the matter that we understand as the computer in front of all of the matter that exists is a creation of Ildabaoth, but ultimately also a creation of Sophia, because Sophia created Ildabaoth. I don't know what else to hit on next, but that's I think that's like that covers kind of what's at the beginning. It goes into a whole thing about how Ildabaoth ends up since it's an androgynous being, it doesn't require a mate, so it has the ability to create offspring. And then it had 7 daughters, and it had seven sons, and each of the different entities that were created had not only they were also androgynous, so they had a male aspect and a female aspect, and basically each of their different names kind of represents different aspects within our collective consciousness. So like things like, I wish I had the information in front of me what their names are, but it was like lust and envy and forethought. What else was there? They're escaping me.
Well, that's a
You know what
perfectly good introduction. So that's how you remember the document, which is again called On the Origins of the World, right?
Yeah, On the Origin of the World.
Right. So I read the same document, and I could give my narrative also from memory, which might be interesting, and then we can actually go back and look at some of the script to get through what it specifically says. But let's again refer back to the biblical narrative just by the point of contrast, right? So the biblical narrative of Genesis begins with, essentially in the beginning, there's a primordial waters, and the Spirit of God is moving back and forth across the darkness of the waters, right, and the deep. And then he goes through the Genesis cycle of creation, separating the waters from the land and creating the earth, and so forth, right? And so there's that narrative and the narrative that God created the heavens and the earth. So God is the creator, and the planet, the heavens and the earth are the work of God. So in the Bible, it says all of creation shows the work of his hands, all of creation shows the glory of his handiwork. All of creation shows the work of his hands, and the firmament showeth his handiwork, meaning the heavens also show his work, his artistry. So in the Christian narrative, matter is the creation of God. In the Gnostic narrative, matter is the creation of Yaldabaoth. And Yaldabaoth, as you said, is an abortion created through an act of masturbation. So rather than sovereign God creating the heavens and the earth, as in the biblical narrative, this woman masturbates and births an abortion. And the abortion becomes what we think of as God, essentially, in the sense of the creator of the world. Now, this is again the Gnostic idea, but there's an interesting thing here, because one thing where I have to disagree with you is that you claim that, she gave birth to this abortion, but as any loving mother would do, she, gave it its own space to create its own things. In other words, like, oh, it's unfortunate I had this horrible abortion baby, but I'm not going to kill it. I'm going to give it a place to live. That would make sense. But that's not what the narrative says. So this is the actual text. And when Pistis Sophia, now Pistis appears to mean faith, and Sophia certainly means wisdom, but also these appear to be personified, intelligent, divine beings or goddesses of some sort. And it's unclear if Pistis Sophia is 2 different people. Anyways, it gets very complicated. But anyways, this being who masturbates, according to the narrative, this female being, gives birth to the abortion, and it doesn't say that she gave him his own little, safe space to live in. It says, Pistis Sophia desired to cause the thing that had no spirit to be formed into a likeness, and to rule over matter and over all her forces. All her forces. And then it says, and there appeared for the first time a ruler, out of the waters, lion-like in appearance, and I posted pictures in general, you can see this lion-like creature, androgynous, having great authority within him, and ignorant of whence he had come into being. Now when Pistis Sophia saw him coming about in the depths of the water, she said to him, child, pass through to here, whose equivalent is Yaldabaoth. So this becomes the creature's name. So let's break down this paragraph. Pistis Sophia begins by masturbating, gives birth to an abortion, which has no soul. she looks at this thing, and again, she is a goddess creature, so presumably she knows exactly what this thing is. She's not ignorant of its nature. She knows it's a soulless abortion. But it says she desired, meaning she wished or intended, to cause the thing, not even a human, a thing, that had no spirit, meaning it had no soul. So this being Pistis Sophia produces the abortion and then has an impulse to make it into a form and then give it rule over matter and all her own forces. So she gives all her armies, all her people, and all her energies to this abortion monster. And then, because of what she has done consciously out of her desire, there appears for the first time, meaning before she did this, this didn't occur and it wouldn't have occurred, a ruler, a king, a lion-like monster, androgynous, with great authority and ignorant. So essentially what you have to understand is if there is a bad guy in the story here, it's not Yaldabaoth, it's Sophia. Because Yaldabaoth is nothing more nor less than her poor, soulless abortion creation. It was her, an apparently divine goddess, who made a conscious free will choice to form this abortion monster into a god monster and then give it all her power. And then not only that, says, child, my child, come through to here, meaning, hey, abortion monster, king god, come here where we are now. So this would appear to be quite a strange set of choices that Sophia has made here. Why did she masturbate? Why did she not wait for her husband to return? Why did she give birth to an abortion monster? Why did she form the abortion monster into the shape of a giant lion god and give it all her power and authority? And why did she then call it her child and bring it to her, if that was the cause of everything that then ensued? Are you still there, Krimson?
Yeah, sorry, I was just doing something real quick. Just keep going.
I'll post that quote there so that everybody can read it in general chat. But again, I'm just saying this narrative doesn't make sense because they're saying kind of Yaldabaoth is the bad guy, but Yaldabaoth is literally soulless, right? He's just an abortion monster, and he wouldn't have even come to life, and he certainly wouldn't have had any power. So, there's no real way to blame him for what ensues. And then the strange thing is, in this document, the rest of the story is it's very obtuse or obscure, really, or hard to understand. But basically, Sophia ends up waging a series of kind of proxy wars and then full-blown wars against Yaldabaoth. But again, she created Yaldabaoth. And then in the end, she destroys him after destroying everything else in the process of fighting the abortion monster that she made. So it's certainly a morally strange story. And anyways, now let's talk about another interesting topic before we go down that road, one you know something about. Where does this Adonai Sabaoth, or rather Sabaoth, as I don't think he's necessarily called Adonai Sabaoth in the story, but Sabaoth, who is this in your understanding of the story?
I'm just trying to help mom do something. But yeah, so Adonaios actually is one of the sons of the demiurge, right? So he had seven sons and 7 daughters who had 2 different aspects. They had two different polarized aspects. They had a negative one and a positive one, each of them, right? So specifically, Adonaios was one of the sons who is Sabaoth, right? So his name essentially is like Sabaoth Adonaios. And the word Sabaoth, like we've already talked about, means Lord, or no, means heavenly host or something, right? Do I have the two? Is Adonai that means Lord, or is it Sabaoth that means Lord?
Okay, so I'll give the background on this, right? So there's a character that appears in this mystic doctrine about the origin of the earth who is called Sabaoth. And in Judaism, one of the 7 holy names of God is Zabaoth. It's actually Zebaot. It's spelled Tzevaot. So it's a very strange word, Zebaot. But it basically is Sabaoth, Zabaoth, it has it, but it's basically Adonai Sabaoth, which means Adonai is Lord, which is often used in place of God with a capital L. And Sabaoth means of the heavenly hosts, and hosts means army, heavenly meaning celestial or divine. And so Adonai Sabaoth is technically a title, meaning Lord of the heavenly hosts, but is actually considered a name as well by rabbis. But in the story, he's Sabaoth. So that being said, what is Sabaoth in the story, do you think?
What is Sabaoth is essentially one of the sons of Ildabaoth, right? One of his creation. Like in the text, it says 7 appeared in the chaos androgynous. They have their masculine names and their feminine names. The feminine name is pronoia, or forethought, Sambathas, which is what it says. But that's actually relating to Ildabaoth's partner that he made for himself, which is his androgynous other half. And his sons, he said, and his son called Yao, his feminine name is Lordship. Sabaoth, his other son, his feminine name is Deity. Adonaios, his feminine name is Kingship. Elios, his feminine name is Jealous. Orios, his feminine name is Wealth. And Astaphios, his feminine name is Sophia, or Wisdom. And now when it comes to the whole Sabaoth Adonaios, there's another Gnostic text that is called the Hopeostasis of the Archons, which is another text that goes from the Nag Hammadi that goes with this. And in that text specifically, it says word for word, it says Sabaoth is Adonai. Right. So again, we talked about how this is confusing and complicated, because we're talking about like multi-dimensional entities that are somehow all existing in one space, but are different, but are the same thing. And that's, I think, where the strangeness gets together. But in the Hopeostasis of the Archons is where it says that Adonaios and Sabaoth are essentially the same entity. That's where that comes from. It's from a different text than this one. But one of the sons, Sabaoth, another one, Adonaios, Elios, Orios, Astaphios, and Yao are the 7 sons. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, and I'll post all the screenshots I took from the document today that I thought were particularly interesting.
And then it says, these are the 7 forces of the 7 heavens of chaos, and they were born androgynous, consistent with the immortal pattern that existed before them, according to the wish of Pistis, which is Sophia. And when it talks about Pistis, my understanding is that this is essentially a higher form of Sophia. The Pistis Sophia is a higher form of Sophia. That is the one that exists in the Pleroma. So if we think of as Sophia as the mother, Pistis Sophia is like the grandmother. And then in the same document, it also talks about Zoe. Zoe is essentially another form of Sophia, but this is like the daughter, right? So we have 3 different kinds of Sophia. We have Pistis Sophia, the grandmother, Sophia the mother, and Zoe the daughter, which are all still instances of the same higher dimensional being, but in different forms. It's putting its energy into these different entities at a lower point in dimension. At least that's my understanding of it.
I just spammed 10 screenshots into the general chat, which aren't gonna, if anyone wants to read them, it's all very interesting, but you have to read the full document to make any sense of it. But nevertheless, it's quite interesting. So here's the narrative we have then. So you have essentially in this story, in so much as we have a character known as God or filling the role of God, the prime mover here seems to be Sophia. She seems to be the first one who kind of initiates things that cause everything else. So rather than God initiating the process of Genesis, we have Sophia initiating the creation of a being who is not God, but is, as you say, a hyper powerful abortion monster created by Sophia's orgasm or whatever, and splooshing of like foul liquids that she creates or whatever or something. it's very strange, right? So it says something about jealousy, and jealousy produces a foul liquid, and then she has like an abortion in the liquid, and then forms it into a giant lion monster god, and all that. But somehow that being creates this being called Adonai Sabaoth. Now, Adonai Sabaoth in Christianity and Judaism is God, like God in the proper sense of big capital G, creator, God, supreme God. That's Adonai Sabaoth. But in this story, Adonai Sabaoth is a secondary creation of an abortion monster created by a masturbating woman. But granted that, what does he go on to do? By him, I mean Adonai. Like, what is the significance? What does he do?
So what does, well, specifically is Sabaoth is the person often. It's only in the hypostasis of the archons does it say that Adonaios and Sabaoth are the same person. Or maybe they are definitely brothers, whatever significance that holds at the very least. But in that case, in that other document says that they're the same person. But Sabaoth specifically is essentially the son of Ildabaoth that rebels against Ildabaoth. So at one point in the document, it says that when Ildabaoth is basically born into the space that he exists, nothing else exists there but the darkness of the waters. And when he realizes that, like, this is his space, he claims that he is God, right? And there is no God before him. Now, in the biblical narrative, we see that these same words were said by the biblical God, Yahweh or Jehovah, right? It says, I am the one God and there is no God before me. So these are also, in this the text, it says that those words came from the mouth of Ildabaoth. And then Sabaoth eventually gets to the point where he realizes that this is not true. His father is not the true God, and he's actually some sort of lesser deity. And when he figures this out, he ends up siding with Sophia, who is basically speaking to him like at almost like in a way like a spirit guide. And he rebels against his father, and as a result of his rebellion, he is cast down into, I believe it says, the seventh heaven, because Ildabaoth exists in the ninth heaven of chaos. And this is another thing that's very confusing, right? So there's apparently two different heavens. There are the holy heavens, which is the realms of where Pistis lives, Pistis Sophia, and then there are the heavens of chaos. The heavens of chaos is where Ildabaoth and all his children live. And apparently each of these heavens has 9 different levels, which again is very complex. But essentially Sabaoth rebels against his father, sides with essentially his grandmother, and it begins this war between the son and the father, essentially.
So here's the full text for anyone who's interested. I highly do recommend you check this out. And I'm just going to post a few more texts of it as well. But I don't think it's correct, right? Doug told you about this before. There isn't really a part of the story where Adonai rebels against Yaldabaoth. I don't think that actually happens in the document.
I think that's not in this one specifically. It's in another text.
It's important that we stick to this document, right? Because this document contains a narrative. We both read it, and this is something everyone can look at. So within this document, right, because this is the complete document. This is on the origins of the world. It tells you the whole narrative, right? So it doesn't say you need to read anything else to understand it. It gives you the complete narrative. It states that that's what it's doing. So containing within this narrative is what I was asking you. What was the role of Sabaoth or whatever? Because again, this is the full story. So if he plays the role, he plays it here. If there's a rebellion against Yaldabaoth, it has to be recorded here because that wouldn't be left out. So what I will say first of all is
I can read a part if you want.
Yeah, like if you have a part that talks about Adonai Sabaoth or whatever, Sabaoth rather, rebelling against Yaldabaoth, please read that because I'm not sure that's exactly what happens.
So there's a whole section here that kind of all applies to what we're talking about. So it says, now when the heavens had consolidated themselves along with the forces and all of their administration, the prime parent became insolent, and he was honored by all of the army of angels, and all of the gods and the angels gave blessing upon him. And for his part, he was delighted and continually boasted, to saying to them, I have no need for anyone. He said, it is I who am God, and there is no one that exists apart from me. And then when he said this, he sinned against all the immortal beings who give answer, and they laid it to his charge. When Pistis saw the impiety of the chief ruler, Ildabaoth, she was filled with such anger to hear him say those words. She was invisible. She said, you are mistaken, Samael. Samael meaning blind god. There is an immortal man of light who has been in existence before you, and who will appear among your modeled forms. He will trample you to scorn, just as a potter's clay is pounded, and you will descend to your mother, the abyss, along with that belongs to you, for the consummation of your works, and the entire defect that has become invisible out of the truth will be abolished, and it will cease to be, and will be like that it has never been. Saying this, Pistis revealed her likeness to her in the greatness of the waters, and in doing so she withdrew up to her light. Now when Sabaoth, the son of Ildabaoth, heard the voice of Pistis, he sang praise to her, and he condemned his father and the word of Pistis. He condemned his father at the word of Pistis, and he praised her because she had instructed them about the immortal man and his light. And then Pistis Sophia stretched out her finger and poured upon him some light from her light, to be a condemnation of his father. So basically, Sophia gave Sabaoth some of her light or energy, and used it as a way, she used that power as a way to condemn his father. It says, then when Sabaoth was illuminated, he received great authority against all the forces of chaos. Since that day, he has been called Lord of the Forces. He hated his father, the darkness, and his mother, the abyss, and loathed his sister, the thought of the prime parent, which moved to and fro upon the waters. And because of his light, all of the authorities of chaos were jealous of him. And when they had become disturbed, they made a great war in the seven heavens. Then when Pistis Sophia had seen the war, she dispatched 7 archangels to Sabaoth from her light. They snatched him up to the 7th heaven, and they stood before him as ascendant. Furthermore, she sent him 3 more archangels and established a kingdom for him over everyone, so that he might dwell above the 12 gods of chaos. Now, when Sabaoth had taken up a place, he reposed in return of his repentance. Pistis also gave him her daughter Zoe, which means life, together with great authority, so that they might instruct him about all the things that exist in the 8th heaven, which he's residing in the 7th. So now Zoe, the daughter of Sophia, is guiding him what is in the 8th heaven, what is in the next ascended level.
That's the sufficiently long
sorry, that was kind of long. Yeah. But that's basically the intro to Sabaoth, the character.
Right. So let's break this down a little bit. The first thing that's strange, again, is that this Sabaoth character is the creation of Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth is the creation of Sophia. Now, on the one hand, if you read it, they kind of, like, we're describing Sabaoth, or Yaldabaoth, as this sort of abortion, which he is described in that sense, but it kind of gives you the wrong idea, because he's this immensely powerful and somewhat magnificent creature, right? He's like a lion-like god thing. And it also describes that he created enormous heavens and paradises for his 7 creatures who had names like jealousy and different strange names, right? So there's 3 creations of 7 and 1 bestowal of 7 in this story. So 3 different beings each create 7 different beings. So the first creation of 7 is Yaldabaoth creating his 7 offspring. And he also creates heavens for each of them. And then, even though he's described also as a creature without spirit, right? And this is what I find strange. How can he be an abortion creature without spirit, and yet he immediately creates 7 other godlike or powerful archon-like beings, including Sabaoth? So how is he creating Sabaoth if he doesn't have a spirit, but he creates Sabaoth just by speaking a word? It's kind of strange. And then Sabaoth somehow is favored by Sophia because she believes he believes her when she tells Yaldabaoth that an immortal man preceded him. Well, the immortal man very strongly appears to refer to Jesus Christ.
Yes.
And this makes sense. This makes sense from the point of view of theology, because it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word of God, of course, is Jesus Christ, who indeed is co-eternal with the true God, and therefore precedes any lesser emanation of God that would come afterwards. So the immortal man, Jesus Christ, has existed since as long as God has, forever.
Mm-hmm.
So
that goes with the
is
biblical narrative, right?
That is the being discussed here. But then you're saying you have this character of Sabaoth, who is a son of Yaldabaoth, who is a son of Sophia, who apparently knows about Jesus, but created Yaldabaoth and gave him all her authority. So it's just very strange. Why did she give all her authority to Yaldabaoth in the first place? And then again, I'm not sure that Sabaoth actually fights against Yaldabaoth. He condemns him, right? He hears what Sophia says, and then he goes, I condemn you, Yaldabaoth, because pistis, which again, it's weird because there's pistis, there's Sophia, there's pistis Sophia, and there's Sophia Zoe. But anyways, so he condemns him, and there is some mention of some kind of fight, but I don't think it's actually Sabaoth who's in that fight. It says that they're jealous of his light, and he has authority against the forces of chaos. And again, who are the forces of chaos? Is that Yaldabaoth's forces?
That's what I would think, yeah.
So Yaldabaoth is associated with chaos, which comes a lot. They talk about chaos here, but and then it says she snatches Sabaoth up into one of these higher heavens and puts 3 archangels there with him where nobody else can go. And this kind of implies, okay, so this is Sabaoth, right? Well, Sabaoth is one of the proper names of God, the God of the Bible. So you're saying, okay, if we assume that Adonai Sabaoth is the same as Sabaoth from the Gnostic doctrine, and it seems obvious it is, because he's the one with the title of Lord of Hosts, and also this favored elevated being. So then you're saying, okay, so the favored son of Yaldabaoth, favored by Sophia, that is given a special blessing from Sophia and elevated to a higher heaven and given archangels by Sophia, right? And then it's not clear that he fights Yaldabaoth. He just condemns him, and then he's spirited up to this higher heaven. But if you then transpose that character into if you try and translate between the 2 narratives at this point, what you're essentially left with is that Sabaoth from this Gnostic doctrine is the Lord of Lords, or the Lord of the Heavenly Hosts, aka Jehovah, Yahweh, the God of the Bible. And Satan in this narrative then is Yaldabaoth. So this is what's going to explain the next part of the narrative, because this is what it essentially is, right? So essentially this is the story of the Bible, right? The only thing is the Bible doesn't include these references to Sophia, because if you break the narrative down from this point, what you get is Sabaoth is in heaven with these archangels, and Yaldabaoth is fought by, I'm not sure exactly who, because it's all very complicated, but there's some kind of war in heaven, just like in the Bible. And Yaldabaoth and his fallen monster angels or whatever are thrown down to earth, just like in the Bible. And then the true man, who corresponds to Jesus, well, first there's a coming of Adam, and then there's a coming of Jesus. But he comes and then destroys all of the works of Satan or Yaldabaoth on earth, or Sophia comes back kind of in the form of avenging Jesus. So anyways, it gets into like an eschatology thing here, and it mirrors the events of Revelations, where the moon stops giving its light, the stars are shaken in the heavens, So essentially it is the narrative of the Bible. The only difference is what we call the God in this narrative becomes Sabaoth, son of Yaldabaoth. Sophia is added in at the beginning and the end when she doesn't appear in the Bible. And Yaldabaoth is transposed into the devil or Satan. And that essentially makes the two narratives more or less coherent. Would you agree with that?
So there's some things I agree and disagree with. Ultimately, for one, so in the part of the document where basically it's in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, right? So the entity that is telling them that they cannot eat of the tree of knowledge and good or evil or any of that, that isn't Sabaoth. So at this point, Sabaoth is in the seventh heaven with the archangels, and they are not in the picture, right? Because this world and the place where Eden is Ildabaoth world. So that the person specifically who said like there is no God before me, which is something that in the Bible it is said that Yahweh Jehovah said, right? Those words were said by Ildabaoth, which means that although you say Sabaoth is essentially the God of the Bible, which I think in parts of the Bible he is, but other parts of the Bible he's not. But in the Bible, instead, what they've done is they've made every single thing that's been done by a fatherly God, whether it was the Father or the Son, they just kind of conglomerated them all together to remove any sort of confusion. But in reality, there are multiple different intelligences here that are engaged in these events. And one of them specifically being this chaotic Ildabaoth guy, he was the one who basically told them, you can't eat from this tree, you can't eat from that tree. Later in it, when it gets into the parts about Adam and Eve specifically and the serpent and all that, we talked about this earlier today. Basically, the serpent, Sophia was speaking through the serpent and like asked, like, you know, what did he say to you about this? The tree of good of good and evil and the tree of knowledge. He said that, well, for one, he told us not to ever eat of it, and that if we did eat of it, we would die. And she said, no, he's lying to you. He said that if you eat of it, he's worried that you will become smart, that you will become wise, and then that you will be able to see the difference between good and evil, and then you will become even greater than he is. And you will become divine and overthrow him, as why he does not want you to eat from that tree. So the serpent that tempted Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge essentially was Sophia.
Okay, so yeah, this is where it gets interesting, so to speak. So first of all, yes, Sophia is associated with creating an entity called the beast. And the beast is, if you do the theological parsing, as I did, unquestionably the same entity as the serpent in the Garden of Eden story. It is described as the beast being the most wise and cunning of all the animals, as also the serpent is described in Genesis. And it is the one that tempts them to eat of the forbidden fruit, as is the serpent do in Genesis. And indeed, he says, it's very strange. Like I tried to parse the language and the description of this creature. It is the most convoluted thing ever because it's referring to a female creation of a female that's androgynous but becomes a male, then has like a female child, but the mother of that child is called the man. It's like the gender swapping in that paragraph is unbelievable. But anyways, long story short, it's the serpent. But the interesting thing is in the Bible, the serpent is never given the title of the beast, right? And that's really interesting because the concept of the beast is very important in Revelation. The beast is one of the three entities that gets cast into the lake of fire to suffer eternal torment, right? The only three beings that are described suffering eternal torment in the lake of fire are Satan, the beast, and the false prophet. Well, who is the beast? The beast is explicitly identified in this Gnostic doctrine as the serpent created by Sophia. And as you've acknowledged, the serpent's role was to talk to Eve and say, you should eat of the tree, even though God told you not to, or Yaldabaoth told you not to. And she said, well, God told us, or Yaldabaoth told us, if we eat of this tree, we shall surely die. And Sophia's beast that she sent, and it says the authorities said, we'll call it beast, and it will mislead the creatures. It'll mislead them and lead them astray. Well, indeed, the beast does lead Eve astray, because he is indeed, the beast, is, assuming it's male, is indeed the one that lied, right, in the narrative, because indeed we do die, right? We were immortal until we ate of that tree, and then we did indeed inherit mortality and all the sufferings we endure. So if you want to look at it, the truth is the beast lied to them, right? They weren't to become as gods, nor did they. They did inherit mortality, and all of creation fell exactly in the biblical narrative. So in the biblical narrative, the world is not fucked up because an abortion monster called Yaldabaoth was created out of a masturbating woman's vagina and then inexplicably given kingship by that same masturbating woman who formed him into a lion-headed god and gave him all her power for some reason. Right? God, in the biblical narrative, created the heavens and the earth perfectly, without any mistakes, being himself a wonderfully powerful, if not absolutely perfect being, right? And indeed was. So the thing that's confusing here, so in the Christian or biblical narrative, the reason for the fall of creation is sin. When people disobey God, given that God's plan is perfect, the disobedience breaks the creation mainframe, so to speak, and introduces death into the world, because the wages of sin is death, and because of sin, death entered into the world. So you have the fallen creation in both cases, but in the second Gnostic case, it's a fallen because it's created by the abortion creature. My point about this is the serpent is the liar, right? And that's why we say that serpent, that ancient serpent, has led the whole world astray, right? And then I posted these, and I'll post these verses in general. But the serpent is explained as the deceiver, and indeed the serpent is the deceiver, identified as the beast, right? So now let's just look at what Sophia has done and consider her character. Sophia masturbates. Sophia creates abortion monster. Sophia turns abortion monster into shape of Monster Man, gives Monster Man all her power, and puts him in charge of all matter. Then she condemns him and gives some angels to his son, but then she creates the beast, and the beast lies to Eve. Eve eats the forbidden fruit, and then all of creation is plunged into suffering.
So this is kind of, again, where I disagree with you, where I think you're not necessarily correct in your understanding or position of it. So it says in the text, word for word, it says, then the authorities received the knowledge of, or gnosis, necessary to create man. So now when they say the authorities, who are the authorities they're talking about? They mean the people in charge. Who's in charge of this space? Ildabaoth, right? So that's when it says the authorities say something, the authorities are Ildabaoth and whatever lackeys or cronies he has, or sons or daughters he created that serve him. Those are the authorities. Let's make that very clear. Then it says in the next line, it says, Sophia Zoe, she who is with Sabaoth. So this means that the daughter of Sophia is not present, and she is with Sabaoth, looking down on this world from the seventh heaven. They are not in the world, but they are observing the world. They had anticipated that the authorities would figure out how to create man, how to create people or body. And then she laughed at their decision, for they are blind. Against their own interests, they ignorantly created them, and they do not realize what they are about to do. The reason she anticipated them and made her own, the reason she anticipated them and made her own man first was in order that he might instruct their modeled form how to despise them and thus to escape them. So basically, Zoe created her own person, or man specifically, first, so that that man would teach the other entities that Ildabaoth was going to create to despise the authorities and realize that they are, the people who you're calling God is not who they say they are. In the next line, it says, now the production of the instructor came as follows. When Sophia let fall a droplet of light, it fell into the water, and immediately a human being appeared, being androgynous. This droplet she molded first as a female body. Afterwards, using the body, she molded it in the likeness of the mother. So basically, she used a drop of whatever they call the waters, this strange substance that can make, and put it into the likeness of the mother, which means that she made it into the likeness of Sophia. and which had appeared. She finished it in 12 months. So within 12 months of forging this drop of water into a person, it became an actual spacesuit entity that could operate within the world of matter. And this androgynous being that was produced, whom the Greeks call hermaphrodite or hermaphrodite, is what it says when they say it out loud and not when we read the actual word, and whose mother the Hebrews call Eve. So basically, it's saying that Zoe, the daughter of Sophia, created Eve in the likeness of the mother, namely the female instructor of life. That was what her job was. Eve's job was to be the female instructor of life. And for her offspring is the creature that is Lord. So all the daughters of Eve were to be the creatures that is Lord, meaning that they were going to be filled with Sabaoth, who is essentially the Lord. Afterwards, the authorities called it beast. Right? So what we're talking about here is we're talking about human body. We're not talking about the serpent in this. We're talking about human body. And it was the authorities who we've already defined as the authorities are Ildabaoth, the gods of chaos, who call it the beast. So it is the human body that is the beast, so that it might lead astray the modeled creatures. So they named it this because they wanted things that they referred to as the beast to be interpreted as to lead people astray. And now the next line says the interpretation of the beast is the instructor. So who is the instructor? In this case, the female instructor of life is Eve, who is Zoe, which is literally like, imagine you're playing a video game. You are a multidimensional entity sitting in the seventh heaven, playing a video game, and your avatar is Eve in the Garden of Eden with Adam. And this is essentially Zoe's avatar, the daughter of Sophia, who is now the instructor, right? And then later in this, it's going to talk about how the serpent was an instance of the instructor. So then we can again allude to the idea that the serpent was being controlled by that same operator of the game avatars, which is Sophia again. So we seem to have this power struggle between the mother and the son. And the son, who is the father, who the father had a son who rebelled against the father. And this seems to be the power struggle.
So, a few things. First of all, we're going to have to, this is going to make me semantically geek out really hard if we get into this, but it's necessary to unpack this paragraph, because I guarantee you it's not what you think it is. Nobody would be expected to understand this sentence. It's written to be not understood. So that's one thing. Now, the beast, you're saying is Eve. Is that correct? Is that what you're claiming?
The beast is the human form.
The beast is the human form. Okay, so I'm not sure that there's anything to back that up necessarily in the narrative here. So okay, we have to start. Let's try and figure out what the beast is, right? So I'm going to read the whole thing. Okay. Now the production of the instructor came about as follows: when Sophia, so we know that Sophia is the start of the whole thing, she lets fall a droplet of light. So the origin of the beast somehow here, or at least the instructor, is this droplet of light emitted by Sophia. And it says, it flowed onto the water, and immediately a human being appeared, androgynous, meaning neither male nor female. Now it says that droplet she molded first as a female body. So now we've gone from androgynous human into a female human. Afterwards, using the body, so using the female body that came out of the androgynous body, she molded it in the likeness of the mother. Okay, so she takes a female body and molds it in the likeness of a mother. So maybe she just makes it look like the mother, let's say. Close your mic, whoever has it open, please. Which had appeared. And he finished it in 12 months. So, and here's something I'm not sure if you noticed or not, Krimson. Several times throughout the document, it's speaking of Sophia, and it uses the male pronoun he. So this means
I just noticed that actually when you said it.
I mentioned that to you earlier in the conversation. This happens several times where it refers to Sophia as male. So there's only two possibilities. One, Sophia is indeed male, or two, Sophia is referred to as both male and female alternately, which would imply then that she is hermaphroditic or androgynous, but probably hermaphroditic. So that's something to consider. And here it's saying also that this being is androgynous. And now it says he finished it in 12 months. So suddenly Sophia has become a man. And now it says an androgynous human being was produced. Well, that's strange because we started with an androgynous human being. So drop of light turns into human being. Human being is androgynous. Human being turns into female. Female turned into likeness of mother. Suddenly creator woman becomes man. All of a sudden we have another androgynous human being whom the Greeks call hermaphrodites, meaning hermaphrodite, male and female. And whose mother, the mother of hermaphrodites being again Sophia, who is he and she, so also presumably hermaphroditic, they call the Eve of life. So now we're being told that Sophia is Eve of life, and then in quotes is Zoe. Okay, so Sophia is Zoe, the mother of the hermaphrodite that was created from the androgynous thing that was turned into a woman, namely the female instructor of life. Okay, so Sophia, aka Zoe, the mother of the hermaphrodite, is now identified as female instructor of life. Her offspring is the creature that is Lord. Okay, well, that makes sense because Sophia's creature was Yaldabaoth, who is Lord of sorts. Afterwards, the authorities called it beast. Well, here's the problem. Linguistically, then, beast refers not to Sophia and not to the instructor, but to her offspring, the creature that is Lord. Right? So it says her offspring is the creature that is Lord. Afterwards, the authority called it beast. Right? And this makes sense because it says so that it might lead astray. Well, there's the image of the beast in Revelations that leads people astray. But the point is the beast doesn't actually refer necessarily to the instructor. It refers to Yaldabaoth, if you interpret this to be the Lord, so that it might lead astray their model creatures. But then here it says the interpretation of the beast is the instructor. So that goes back to the beginning. This is how the instructor was created. So even after you're breaking down, it makes like the least bit of sense. Like the paragraph is
Extremely
completely
confusing.
It's insane. It goes like the drop of light turned into a woman, a body. The body turned into an androgynous body that turned into a woman that turned into its mother. Then another androgynous thing happened, and then that thing had a son that was a man and a woman, and then I'm a man now, and then I have a son that's the Lord, and the Lord is called the Beast. And the beast is the instructor, and I'm the instructor. It's like, what? It literally doesn't mean anything, basically. And that's kind of, I think, where I come to with this is like, given the complete sort of incoherence of this narrative, in the sense that like, none of it makes any sense, right? It's like, why did Sophia do any of this? Because the whole thing is really, it's not a story of Sophia versus Yaldabaoth. It's just a story of Sophia having like a bipolar war against herself. She initiates everything that happens, and then she's always the one who's fighting and helping everyone else. So when she supports Sabaoth, she's just supporting her own grandson that she created by creating Yaldabaoth. And when she fights Yaldabaoth, she's just fighting her own son. So everyone in the story is subordinate to her, and essentially she creates all of them herself. So the problem of like morality that people have with God, where they're like, well, how can God fight Satan? Like, because he created Satan. It's quite a lot worse here because this is just Sophia fighting her own children and grandchildren, or using, you know what I mean? It's like very bizarre.
Yeah, it is. Like, that's why, like, parts of it, right? Like, we have to be able to make sense of parts, right? Because there are some things that are really hard to even wrap your mind around. And like, I do my best to try and interpret it the best I can, right? But like, I feel that just like the Bible, you could have 20 different people read it and you're going to have 20 different interpretations of what it meant.
It's really not, though. That's what I would hold. We say just like the Bible, but on the contrary, the Bible is totally coherent. Like
way more
explain it, and any other Christian can understand it. It's totally coherent. Whereas this narrative, I think, is bizarre and kind of ridiculous. I mean, when you think about it, it's just crazy. Like, this now goes into the meta. Like, do you really think that this whole world with, like, you know, people and beautiful people, music and sun and sunshine and happiness and love and stars and planets and animals and plants and oceans is all just the result of some like blind abortion monster created by masturbation Like, doesn't that seem like please allow me to finish. It seems like a highly profane and like just kind of gross and like soulless and insane cosmology, and the only kind of purpose it appears to have is sort of to mock the creator by saying he's this abortion monster created by masturbation. And then it just introduces a much more convoluted theology that makes a lot less sense. So I just find it kind of hard to get my head around.
So one thing that I think we need to be clear about is the position in time when all this is happening, right? So this is a lot of these events, especially the ones at the beginning, have happened before the world has even been created, right? So there is just nothing. Ildabaoth comes into existence in complete darkness, right? There is nothing that exists yet in that space. And it isn't until through these events that happen between Ildabaoth, Sophia, his sons, the daughters, all these things, it isn't until after all these events happen is the world even created, and then the first Adam and Eve created, and then the whole, it kind of goes into almost a direct parallel of the biblical narrative when it comes to the Garden of Eden. The only place that it really disagrees with it is the fact that the serpent is not Satan, it's not evil, it is actually the Sophia who was trying to tell them the truth. That's where the big difference is.
Well, yes, that is one big difference, that rather than the serpent of the Garden of Eden story being like a malicious deceiver, it's this drop emitted from Sophia that becomes an androgynous hermaphrodite, which really it's not clear what the significance of that even is. But it's called the instructor, and the authorities call it the beast. It's called the instructor in the narrative. And it emerges from a drop that turns in the end into one hermaphrodite and one woman. So I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. But in the end, there is another war, and the entities associated with Yaldabaoth are cast down to Earth, and then later Sophia comes back in like war mode, just like Jesus comes back in the book of Revelations in war mode, Revelation, and she destroys everything basically. And it says the Son of Man, or not the Son of Man, but the Word comes, and it says the Word is superior to all other beings, right? And the Word in biblical theology is Jesus. It says the Word is superior to all other beings, and came for only one reason, so that whatever was hidden would be made known and everything would be revealed, basically, which makes sense. Apocalypse means revealing, Revelations means to reveal, Revelation means to reveal, and Jesus says whatever is done in the darkness will come to light, and all things that are secret will be made known and blasted from the rooftops. So that's coherent, right? So in other words, the word, right, which is what we call Jesus and the Word of God, comes at the end and reveals everything, and then it says all people go according to their thoughts, according to their beliefs, according to their deeds. They each go to where they come from, basically. So I assume this to mean, evil people go to an evil end, and good people go to a good end, some kind of justice of sorts. Yeah. But the other strange thing is, again, Sophia is described as the daughter of Yaldabaoth, right? So in the narrative, she, according to you, masturbates. I don't think it actually says she masturbates anywhere in the narrative, but in some sense, something happens. I don't even think it's Sophia who does it. I don't think
it does say that. Not in all the translations.
I'm not sure if it does in this story. In this story, it's not even Sophia who creates Yaldabaoth. It says something about like some kind of cosmic jealousy that existed even before Sophia, and then it like gushes water. I don't know. It's very bizarre. I'll have to read it again. But I think it's actually something else that goes wrong even earlier.
Yeah, I think that the whole thing starts off right with the idea that there was a thing before chaos, right? But in a lot of other, different kinds of realms of thought and theology, chaos was the preceding first thing. But right off the hop, it's already saying there was a time and a thing that existed before. Right, and then like you said, there probably is some, and we were doing that thought experiment the other day about like, what was the first thought of God? What was the first thing to happen? And I often engage in those kinds of thoughts, trying to figure out what was the first things, right? So I think you're right. I think there could even be some sort of issue that existed before all this, for the reason why Sophia's husband wasn't present for the creation of son Ildebaoth, right? Because for some reason he wasn't there. Maybe something did happen. Maybe, again, like you said, something to do with jealousy. But it seems that as a result of all of these entities and their interactions, as above, so below, it has an effect on us and on our world. And one thing I wanted to cover was especially regarding the whole thing about the serpent, right, and deceiving them. It says in this part right here, it says, the seven of them laid their plans. They came up to Adam and Eve timidly. They said to him, the fruit of all the trees created for you in paradise shall be eaten. But as for the tree of knowledge, control yourselves and do not eat from it. If you eat, you will die. Having imparted great fear to them, they withdrew up to their authority, back up to, where they come from, to their boss, Ildebaoth. Then came the wisest of all creatures, who was called Beast, right? And this is what you were talking about earlier. But again, the Beast is the instructor. And who is the instructor? The instructor is Sophia. And when he saw the likeness of the mother Eve, he said to her, what did God say to you? It was it, do not eat of the tree of knowledge, she said. He said, not only do not eat from it, but do not touch it, lest you die. He said this to her, do not be afraid. In death you shall not die, for he knows that when you eat from it, your intellect will become sober, and you will come to be like gods, recognizing the difference that obtains between evil men and good ones. Indeed, it was in jealousy that he said this to you, so that you would not eat from it. So that basically this thing that's talking to them, and I don't even think it says that it is a snake or anything. It just says who is called Beast. And earlier it was said that the authorities called the instructor Beast. So it doesn't even say it's a snake. It doesn't even say it's a serpent, but it does say who is called Beast. And it basically says that he told you not to eat it because he knew that you would become sober, you would gain intelligence, and through your intelligence you would recognize the difference between good and evil, and therefore recognize him as evil. And he said this out of jealousy because he does not want you to see that, so that you do not, become greater or overthrow him.
So here's one problem with the narrative, at least laid out this way. If you go way back to the beginning of the narrative, it actually says that Sophia has already thrown Yaldabaoth down into Tartarus and bound him up there. And Tartarus, in the Bible, is a deep, dark prison prepared for the devil and his angels, right? So in the King James is one of the many different words that is, incorrectly translated as hell. But it is a prison in an underworld for Satan and the fallen angels. So check this out. So if you scroll up to today at 9:24 p.m. where it says, and the great red dragon was thrown down, well, right underneath that, you have a quote from the Gnostic scripture here. And it says, I don't know, it said right before because here, I'll just repost it again at the bottom. So this is from earlier in the story. And it says, she sent forth her breath and bound him and cast him down into Tartarus. Since that day, the heaven, along with its earth, has consolidated itself through Sophia, the daughter of Yaldabaoth, who is below them all. So the first bizarre thing is that she, in our understanding, we want to think that she created Yaldabaoth. But here she's identified as Yaldabaoth's daughter, which would, of course, mean she didn't create Yaldabaoth. And secondarily, it says that Yaldabaoth is confined in Tartarus. And that's also something that some of the other sources, Gnostic sources I found, said that Yaldabaoth is essentially already in hell, or in Tartarus, where he tortures souls in burning pitch. And in other words, would then fill sort of the role of the modern misunderstanding of Satan as this being who's ruling hell, torturing souls. That's actually Yaldabaoth. But later in the narrative, it's going to say that Yaldabaoth and his angels were cast down or as creatures were cast down to earth, and that's why the whole world is in corruption, and that's why everybody's worshiping all these false gods and idols and doing magic and blood sacrifice and human sacrifice. And again, this is the Christian narrative, is that's exactly the case, right? It's because Satan and his fallen angels were cast down onto earth, and they've been causing all this evil and corruption in people's behavior, spiritually, false doctrines, false teachings, blood sacrifice, black magic, etc. Now, in this narrative, it's very confusing. It just seems to go every which way. But it does all end with an apocalypse revelation, a judgment at the return of Jesus, and Sophia coming back in some kind of avenging mode. And so it largely matches it. So I guess this is what I want to ask you, right? It's like, what makes you take seriously this Gnostic narrative? In other words, what is it about it, given that it is so bizarre and seemingly self-contradictory and kind of all over the place? And like, what makes you think to take it seriously?
Well, I think that I should analyze all sources of information, try and gain an understanding of it, and that information to help refine my theory of what I believe to be true. Right? Like, I can't just discredit any information and woo McDonald's garbage until I, give it the old college try. And like I said, I'm relatively new to this realm of Gnostic thought, right? I've only been researching this for 2 months, I think, about. And, I think that it's extremely interesting. I think the idea that, it's very clear we're not told the truth or the whole story. So if we want to figure out what the truth is, the only way we can is by indulging in the different narratives until we can find enough parallels to realize that, well, if it says this here, it says that here, this happened here, that happened there, all these parallels line up, we can at least say that there's a good chance that these parallels are true, right? So what are the biggest parallels for me between the biblical narrative and this narrative? So the biblical narrative, and I've said this many times, who said, I am God and there is no God before me, right? In the biblical narrative, that would be Yahweh or Jehovah who said that, who is God. But in the Gnostic narrative, it is Ildebaoth, who ultimately is not projected as a very good character. But at the same time, we also know that Adonai, or Sabaoth, this son of Ildebaoth, is some sort of righteous son who wants to conquer the evil father and has all the support of his mother, who is Sophia. And like you said too, Sophia is also the daughter of Ildebaoth. And this is the strange thing about these aeons, is because they have this strange ability to be in multiple places at once, they often re-represent themselves in many different forms through this type of like omnipresence is the only way I can really understand it. And like, so not only is Sophia one of the daughters of Ildebaoth, but it's also Ildebaoth's mother. It's also Pistis Sophia, the grandmother of Ildebaoth, and it is also the daughter of Sophia, Zoe. So all of these entities all come back to basically like the prime mother, right? Which is the first point of separation of infinity, from my perspective, where infinity, the androgynous prime creator, separated into two forms, the father god and the mother god, right? And then the father god and the mother god would essentially be Christos, Sophia, is what my belief is.
Okay. So, and just to clarify, I take the Apocrypha and the Gnostic Gospel seriously. I think that one of the most important groups of scriptures in the world, one, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Apocrypha. So you got the canon, which is the 66 books included in the King James Version, is most commonly thought of as modern canon. Just close your mic, Crimson. And then you have the Deuterocanon, which is included by the Catholic Church, but not the King James Version. And then you got the Apocrypha, which are books like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, and many other books. And then you got the Gnostic Gospels, which are, and maybe I'm mixing some of these up, but the Gnostic Gospels are the ones like this one, very bizarre and from the Nag Hammadi. The Dead Sea Scrolls has, I think, the Apocrypha in the canon, and the Nag Hammadi has the Gnostic Gospels. Now, one thing I'll say is I actually think, or at least have a theory, that Pistis is actually a male, and Sophia is perhaps the female, and Pistis Sophia is a male and a female or something, because again, it does switch back and forth between the pronouns, the female and male frame of reference, and it repeatedly says he. I actually think it says he possibly more than it says she, if it even says she at all, because it definitely says he more than once. So the gender of Sophia is actually a little bit of a question mark. It's not clear that it is female. Now, secondarily, there's ties into another thing called the two powers in heaven thesis, which is that there's actually two different gods in the Bible, and that there was two different powers in heaven in the original Jewish conception. And this is sort of a whole other related concept, and it also ties into the theory that the two gods in the Bible are Yahweh and El, and that Yahweh then would be associated with the Jewish cult of Yaldabaoth, and El ties into the theory of Jesus the Phoenician, would have been thought of as El the Compassionate, and perhaps Jesus was the son of El or something. I mean, all these different theories kind of tie together with these.
I actually really like that theory, because if we when I get into that realm of thinking, so if we look at, you know, the Ildabaoth, the Jewish cult one you said, right, and then El, I believe that El would be, in the context of this document, would be Sabaoth, right? So the one thing that leads me to believe that, right, is the god El is essentially the person who has all of the archangels, right? So you have Michael, Raphael, fucking Sataniel, fucking Uriel, all of them end in El, right? Because it means like of El is what El, the thing means, which is like of God. So we know from this text who has the seven archangels plus 3 or 4 other archangels that were given to him by Sophia. Sabaoth does, right? So El being the god of the archangels, because El being the primary suffix at the end of all of the archangels' names, can only really lead us to believe that the character of Sabaoth is the god El, right? And again, I do also believe that there are two gods in the biblical narrative, and sometimes which one is which at what point is very unclear.
Well, and this also ties back into the Babylonian and Sumerian story of Enki and Enlil. So if you go back to essentially the oldest human documents, which I think is Sumerian cuneiform A and cuneiform B, it describes essentially these two beings, Enki and Enlil, largely interpreted to be like extraterrestrial entities by Zachariah Stitchin, who became popular and sort of launched the whole ancient alien thing, chariots of the gods, etc. But essentially the narrative there is kind of one of the two brothers created humans and wanted them to remain sort of autonomous workers, or autonomic workers, or whatever, robotic, semi. And then Enlil, I don't know which was which. The other one wanted to give them self-awareness, and presumably did, since we have it now. And so this is sometimes thought to be sort of the proto-narrative, and a lot of the biblical narrative comes from this. So, for example, the Noah's flood is in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is the original telling of it before the Bible, and it's all over the world as well. So this is why you come into just layer upon layer of comparative mythology, comparative theology, et cetera, et cetera. So it's infinitely complicated, and we're probably going to have to do a series of podcasts, but I think we've covered quite a lot of ground here. And it was quite interesting, and we're not out of time. I'm just trying to think what we should focus on for the rest. Maybe we should open up now for questions or comments from the audience, if anyone wants to chime in.
Did you talk about the concept of mind parasites, about how the archons are perceived as such in the Nag Hammadi?
Yeah, thank you. We didn't really get into archons properly yet. So, yeah, does anyone want to start by talking about archons?
Well, in specifically on the origin of the world that we're talking about, that we kind of introduced at the beginning of this. So the first archon is essentially Yaldabaoth, right? So now we have to ask, what is an archon? An archon is some sort of higher dimensional being that, I guess, is some sort of ruler of a space. Now, when we also think about archons, some people believe that the planets themselves are archons. So there is an archon for Saturn, an archon for Jupiter, all of these entities, and we've talked about this in the past about this like anthropomorphized intelligences that are like related to each planet, and each planet itself it would be qualified as an archon, or a ruler is basically what an archon is a ruler of the space.
Right, but they're referred to as mind parasites, and I think the reason why is because, I mean, my personal opinion, I think I've said it before, but I'll repeat it here, is that the Archons are gray aliens, and they were using their technology to manipulate reality of individuals. And to manipulate this reality, Joseph, you're reverbing real bad.
Sorry.
To manipulate the reality of these individuals that they claimed to do, they would parasite off them effectively. They would use this spiritual parasitic technology. And I correlate it to gray aliens and neurocybernetics or brain implants, using telepathy. That's kind of like, that's the allegory I see coming from it from the ancient times. Because what we perceive the technology they use is dreamland technology, like to manipulate dreams, to manipulate your reality, to make you think about things using visual images and, creating a false reality for the subject. And I believe they're the source of all of this concept of schizophrenia on Earth came from the archons that exist as gray aliens.
And I could see some legitimacy to your position in that as well, because like, so if things, where it comes to like the dream space or that realm where things happen, from my understanding, that's essentially like where the fourth dimension, so like the astral plane, the mental plane, this is like the fourth dimension. So if there is an archon that rules on the fourth dimension, very, very much so, it could be some sort of extraterrestrial presence, or extra dimensional presence, I think would be more accurate. I don't know. Even when we look at like the gray aliens, like you talk about, from my understanding and the research I've done, the gray aliens are just husks. They're just temporary genetically engineered bodies that these archons, or these intelligences, can inject their consciousness into to engage with the realm of matter, because it's only within the third dimension is matter as we understand it exists, because above the third dimension, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, whatever dimensions, there isn't physical matter. Things become different. Things become like semi-etheric. Things become literally made out of pure thought. And that's probably the realm that they are manipulating from your position.
That just sounds like hocus pocus stuff, where the concept would be that this is a computer system that's uploaded, that is a sentient intelligence. And if you want to call them husks, that it's uploading their consciousness to these husks, the empty vessels, if you will, programmable biological entities that are controllable through this technology that manipulates reality. And it manipulates it for the gray aliens. That's their interface, and they're the slaves to this system. But I don't think there's anything fourth dimensional about it or spiritual about it. I think it's a technology. I think it's an ancient technology, and I think we haven't been able to interpret it up until the recent times because of our misunderstanding of the beyond. And in regards to the dreams altering states, like if you can focus energy over the eyeballs while people are sleeping and give them dreams in certain states. And I think it's just that. I don't think it's any kind of they're going into your brain and interfacing with your spiritual being and all this stuff. I think they're literally just showing you a movie over your eyeballs with like lasers while you're sleeping. But
well, thank you for
anyway,
introducing that element of it as well, and we can talk about that more. I just want to ground it in the basics of the definitions. Archon in Gnosticism. Archons are in Gnosticisms and those religions tied to it, the builders of the physical universe. In the writings of the Nag Hammadi Library, the Archons are rulers, each related to one of 7 planets. They prevent souls from leaving the material realm. The political connotations of their name reflects rejection of the governmental system as flawed, without chance of true salvation. In Manichaeism, the archons are the rulers of a realm within the kingdom of darkness who together make up the prince of darkness. And then it talks about the hebdomad, and you can see there's 7. So this is, I believe, the first 7 created in that narrative. These are the 7 created by Yaldabaoth. And it says a characteristic feature of the Gnostic concept of the universe is the role played in almost all Gnostic systems by the 7 world-creating archons, semi-hostile, lowest emanations of the Godhead, and proceeding from them the devilish powers. And then here it says, I'm just going to read this really quickly. Yeah, and so here's an interesting thing. People don't realize archons are in the Bible, right? Like archons aren't just not Gnostic. They're explicitly referenced in the Bible. And that's where you get the our contest is not with flesh and blood, rather the authorities of the world and the spiritual hosts of wickedness. This refers to the archons, and Satan is actually referred to as the archon of this world. And it says it was they whom Christ had been sent to earth to overcome, right? So this is really the key point, and I'm just going to read this last short definition. In Gnosticism, the archons, from Greek ruler, archon, were malevolent, sadistic beings who controlled the earth, as well as many of the thoughts, feelings, and actions of humans. They assisted their master, the demiurge, with the creation of the world and continued to help him administer his oppressive rule.
I was just going to say the definition in Greek of archon just means ruler, by the way.
And that's what
Right. So,
I do agree with your guys with the position of the idea that the planets are the archons. And when it says that essentially, like, you know, Eldabaoth being the first archon created the other planets, I think that the scary thing about that realm of thought is the idea that it's possible that the sun could be Eldabaoth and then the other planets could be his children. And I think that's probably the most fucked up thing about it, because we, in many other realms of theology, understand the sun as this sacred thing, right? But I don't know, right? Like, I think that's tough. But if the planetary bodies are related to the archons, and the archons are essentially the rulers, and we know even in what is it called, astrology, each of the planets are considered rulers of houses, right? I don't. This is a bumpy road.
Sun worship stuff was like, so the sun, it covers the planet in half of the day, and as the sun sets, the darkness comes out and all this stuff. That's where you get the duality concepts with this Ra and all that. Like that's Egyptian though, but yeah.
well, Crimson, look at this though, because it's interesting. You said that, and I posted this before, but I'm going to post it again. It's right up here. But basically, it was interesting that you said, if would Yaldabaoth be the sun? Because look at this picture. I was looking and had the thought right when you said it. Because look at the picture. Right? It shows the Earth as the big planet in the middle, and then you count. There's the 7, or at least the 6 of them are visible, or 5 of them are visible. But those are presumably the archons. But then their heads are all going up towards the sun, and the sun is like shining there. So all their energies are like going into the sun, and then it shows the other planets around the Earth. I don't know. But
It's very trippy.
The main point that I think I take away from it is, because to me the core of Christianity and what it really is all about, at least in terms of cosmology and ontology, is understanding that Earth, where we live, is not really the kingdom of heaven. It's not the kingdom of God. It's not in God's control. It's the kingdom of Satan, right? And so the narrative is the same. It's that we are in a fallen creation inhabited by a powerful sort of evil god we call Satan, and all his creations and archons, which archons are literally Satan and the fallen angels. Those are the archons, the spiritual forces of darkness in heavenly places. And the narrative is the same, that, you know, we humans are in need of Jesus Christ, who's going to come back and break the power of Satan and the archons. So in other words, this Gnosticism properly understood is simply Christianity properly understood. Jesus is the Savior. What is he saving us from? Yaldabaoth and the archons, yeah, or Satan and the archons, because we call Satan.
Sorry, I had read somewhere that somebody thought that Jesus was in a Gnostic mushroom cult, taking mushrooms before, like in the time that he was that he didn't have logs of what he was doing in his life before, like up to the last few years or whatever, and that's how he kind of got to experience concept of God. I personally think Jesus was being affected by these ETs though in this manner, and when he was communicating to things, he was communicating to the ETs, artificial intelligence. That's my theory, but
Yeah, well, we should do another podcast with you because it's time to do another one anyway. And also, this one's already been quite long, so I think we should actually probably wrap it up soon. Crimson, you want to get a last word here, a summary? Or...
Yeah. So there's one thing I just want to issue, and I think there's something that we can both agree on here, Shogun, is that I think we're in agreement that the idea that Ildabaoth is what we would call Satan, right? Or the understanding of the evil person, the person that is doing the bad things, that is of chaos, that wants to deceive people and limit us and keep us, down. Can we agree that Ildabaoth represents that if we draw the parallels?
If we draw the parallels, yeah, if we're assuming you can translate one to the other, or if you can try as best you can to do so.
Yeah. So, but now the second big thing, right, is so Satan, was he the one who rebelled and was cast down to earth, right?
Wait, was that a question?
Yeah, who rebelled against God. And
in the Christian narrative, it's broadly understood to be Satan, and then some people also speak of Lucifer, and there's some ambiguity as to whether these are different entities or the same entity.
So, but now this is a thing where now we're already off the hop. So we understand that Ildabaoth in this narrative is the creator of this world, right? And he is essentially Satan. In the biblical narrative, it says Satan is the lord of this world. But this character who is cast down as a rebelling against the Father, we know in the Gnostic text that the person who rebelled against the Father, or against Ildabaoth specifically, was his son, Sabaoth, who is a good character, who is in support and of not only Sophia, the mother, but also in support of Jesus Christ, as well as the person who is assigned all of the archangels. And also it says in the same text that Sabaoth was the creator of the seraphim. So we can agree.
Was the creator of the seraphim?
Yeah, it says it. Here, I can find it. Go back on this page.
Were you going to say something, Hermes?
Yeah, I had a question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So, what is the purpose or the end goal of the Archons or the Ildabaoth keeping us down? Like, what's the goal? Like, why? What did they gain from it?
Well, from my perspective, right, the reason they want to stay in control is because they don't want us in control of this space. That space was made by them and belongs to them, and we are existing in their space. So if we could figure out a way to take this space under our control, we could change things in reality to better serve us if we had the same powers as one of these creative gods. And then secondly, the other motive here is like in a lot of the New Age stuff, when they talk about archons, like what NSA was talking about, was that there's some type of parasite, which means that we produce some sort of energy that is food for them. And in some of the New Age concepts, the archons, they feed on like loosh, this concept of energy that's called loosh. And the loosh is essentially this energy that we produce, and because we produce it, we're like little water fountains that they can drink from, because they are not immortal creatures necessarily. I believe that at some point something happened where they no longer had the connection to the thing that gives them immortality, and then as a result they required us and to breed us to the point where they had lots of food, because if we would stop feeding them, they would ultimately die.
I don't think the loosh thing. I think that came out of David Wilcock, and I think
it could have, but that's just I'm just saying that's just another realm of possibility.
I know, but
the defining feature of archons is that they trap people in this plane. So they are the entities that trap human souls in this world, and the Gnostics were concerned with actually learning a series of like passwords and like secret answers to questions and different things, because when they died they thought they'd get tested by each of the, I guess, 7 different archons or whatever, and they'd have to get past them all to get back to home base or whatever.
2 things about it too in the modern time. So Philip K. Dick, a prominent sci-fi writer, he's doing amphetamines, but he wrote a lot of crazy sci-fi stuff like Valis and so forth. He writes and describes about something called the Black Iron Archon Prison, and how it's this thing that he interacted with. I think he perfectly describes how the ET's technology interacts with them, but he was referring to it as that. There's also something called Project 89, which was a PSYOP developed, I believe, by MI6 to utilize people that were being targeted by the quote archons so that they could recruit and manipulate them. It's kind of interesting stuff out there if you read through the Project 89 stuff, because it parallels a lot of New Agey / archonic Gnostic stuff that, like, you know, backdrop run by Mason and intelligence communities. So the stuff is still being rehashed and reused in regards to the concepts, but I don't think it's any kind of loose kind of feeding off them. I literally think it's just they're chipping heads with neurocybernetics and then trying to puppet them around with telepathy.
Yeah, but this was one thing I was talking to you the other day. Like, again, like Hermie said, what's the motive? What's the end game? Like, if they wanted to take over this world, they could have long done that, right?
Well,
so for some reason, they want to keep us alive. They want to make sure that we're breeding because we provide them something. And the idea that they are some type of energy parasites, I think, is very valid, because they need a motive for our existence. Because if we don't do anything for them, there's no reason to keep us around. So there has to be some sort of motive.
That's what I mean, though. They're not parasites in that they get energy from us. They get like think like a soul farm. So like when you brain implant somebody and monitor them, you monitor an entire person, and you have a profile of everything they do and say and think in artificial intelligence. So they effectively have your soul. There's a guy named Robert P. Duncan. He wrote a book called Project Soul Catcher about what the DIA and CIA projects were going on about neurocybernetics and things like that, and this TI stuff. And that correlates to feeding them to these archons to be used as MK Ultra puppets, if you will. And so it's not that they're feeding off them; they're using people in their efforts on Earth to take over the planet, and they need to figure out how to control people better by using this technology and conditioning and drugs and all these things that go with all manner of evil. And it correlates to what the Nazis were doing, all kinds of shit. So it's like it all connects to what's going on in the modern time.
And I agree with the idea of the MK Ultra puppets, right? So, like, from my understanding, the research I'd done about MK Ultra, the number one goal in any MK Ultra thing is that first you have to shatter the consciousness, and you have to basically trap the part of the person that is that person, or that is their expressed soul, into some type of box, put it at the back of the mind, turn that body into a husk, very much like the gray aliens have, into a body that is susceptible to possession by an entity. And then possibly through that process, these entities or archons or higher dimensional or lower, who knows what their position is, but these dimensional entities then have a body to engage in this dimension and play the game, which they normally wouldn't have, because, as Shogun said in the past, these fallen angels, they didn't get bodies.
Yeah, that's what I mean, though. I think we've created allegory and story around all this concept and contact to make up what's going on, when in reality it's very simple. It's synthetic telepathy, brain implants, augmented reality technology, extraterrestrials, and very wealthy intelligence communities that used to believe they were Luciferian.
But try telling that to somebody 2,000 years ago.
Right. No, that's what I mean. Like, this is where we populated all this lore about it, and all these stories and religions and gods and angels and all this other stuff. But we were very simply dealing with a very simple technology we can actually mimic.
And I said this to you the other day. I was actually listening to Happiostasis of the Archons, and I was actually becoming super confused, because like Shogun said, like, some of these things are just like really hard to make sense of, because they're kind of all over the place. And then I came to the realization, I'm like, what if it's all just bullshit? What if every religion is just bullshit? And it's literally, like NSA said, it's just all fucking extraterrestrials that are all in competition with each other for this fucking game world. And right
I've been
now,
trying to say.
clowns are winning. Clowns are winning right now.
Well, that's what I said. Whenever the ET would talk to me, I asked, "Why are you doing this?" And he shows a little ET gray alien shooting a basketball into a hoop to say, "I'm just playing with you," because these people that they target and our species are just a game to them.
I have another question, if that's okay. So you said the archons are rulers, but what does that really mean? What does it mean to rule? Where does their authority come from? How do they derive it? And furthermore, if they are more powerful than we are, then why do they need us? Even as something to, feast on or harvest. Like the only reason we need animals is because we're too dumb to figure out how to make artificial meat the way we want. So we don't have materializers like Star Trek. So it is our inability to get what we want through other means that we have to use sacrifices. So in this scenario where they're powerful rulers of the space with so much power, why would they need us?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, it comes back to the question I asked before: what's the motive? And it's very hard to understand because, like I said, if they wanted this place, they could have taken it with their advanced technology. Unless they are unable to do that for some reason.
It's not that complicated. So even if you just look at the mainstream definition of archons, which I posted, they're described as malevolent sadistic beings. So that is their motivation. A malevolent being just enjoys hurting things and wants to cause pain and suffering, and sadistic beings take pleasure from pain. So whether that's literally in the sense that they harvest some essence called loosh that is like a drug to them, or whether it's just in a more general sense they're just spiteful and malicious from a Christian theological point of view, because Satan and the fallen angels already know the end because they can read the Bible and Scripture as well as anybody else and so forth. They already know that in the end they're going to go to the lake of fire or whatever. So they're essentially just trying to torment and corrupt humanity and human souls and so forth as much as possible. That's why all the child sacrifice and, child abuse shit and satanic ritual abuse and circumcision and abortion and, burning children and the Moloch Baal shit and all that is just because essentially they just want to pervert people and turn people away from God for that reason, being in rebellion against God and following this entity called the Great Red Dragon or Satan, who is essentially the devil. Now, if you want to call that being Yaldabaoth, that's fine. Because in both narratives, it's the same scenario. There is a corrupt kind of false god, Samael, the blind god, in the Gnostic narrative, Yaldabaoth, aka the devil, Satan, the red dragon. And therefore, all the earth is plunged into suffering and corruption because of these beings. And so the only thing to do is to, turn it onto the Savior, which is Jesus Christ in both narratives. So both are Christian. That's why there is Gnostic Christianity as well as Gnostic Luciferianism and Gnostic Satanism. And these are very different interpretations, right? Like Doug is a Gnostic Christian. Sir Dougleton, he's a Gnostic Christian. I have other friends who, in my opinion, are more affiliated with Gnostic Luciferian doctrines, and that's another subject. And that just depends on your orientation towards certain elements of the theology. Because even if you have the same pieces, you can have different thoughts about what they mean. So, it's very complicated.
I just want to touch on that real quick. Most of our emotions, from my understanding, comes from, at some point, it serves a function. So like sadism can serve the function of making a point to an enemy tribe or whatever. There's reasons for why we do stuff like vengeance. Could be to inflict pain on the other side as a method of what is it called? Conditioning, such as if you commit a crime, then you suffer. So for these beings that are supposedly logical, I would hope, if they're greater than us, there does not seem to be any rationale behind rebelling. There does not seem to be any rationale behind wasting energy and dragging other people down with them. I mean, that's not a benefit in any way. There's nothing logical about that. It's just and sadism, sure, but sadism without a purpose is just insane. It's just like it's even more insane. And I refuse to think that things are so illogical. I do think even if things are wrong, there's still usually like a reason behind it where you can pinpoint why things are the way they are. And this just seems to be so random, you know, just hatred for the sake of hatred, being evil for the sake of being evil, being just I don't see it.
Well, from my perspective, I kind of from listening to you guys talk for the last little bit, I think I kind of came to the realization that the motivation here, not only like Shogun said, is because they take pleasure in hurting things and being evil, but like I think it's to prevent us from regaining control of the world we live in, right? Because as long as they continue to create chaos to the point where we can't focus enough to be able to develop whatever skills and abilities are required to be able to ascend to the next heaven, like these Aeons, like Sophia and Sabaoth did. I think that that's why they do it, is to prevent us from essentially overthrowing them, because they don't want their game to end, right? And I think that it's possible that in the return of Jesus Christ, you know, that overthrowment and the reclamation of this planet, creating you know, heaven on earth, it could be a result of the power shift from these archontic rulers into the hands of, you know, more of the prime creator, or the God, or Jesus.
Try to look at it from a sort of logical
I
perspective.
wanted to say something to Hermes too, which is just that, you know, it's all well and good to say that certain things don't make sense to you, or like does seems illogical, but unfortunately that's itself an illogical standard to use when making ontological claims about what is, right? Because as we know, think about real life, right? I could list scenario after scenario that's 100% real and yet totally absurd, and you would never think it would ever happen. It's just completely ridiculous. But the truth is, real life is like that all the time. The truth is stranger than fiction. So, you know, you can't say, oh, well, if there were entities, they wouldn't just be malicious. They wouldn't just be sadistic. Well, how do we know? We know there's people that are malicious and sadistic, and that's just as irrational. Why would people be that way? Why would aliens? Why would angels? You know, why would angels not be? You know, so I think you can say it doesn't make sense to you, but a lot of the time the world doesn't make sense to us, and we have to deal with what is, not what we wish were or what we would do if we were in charge or anything like that. It's just about what is. And that was actually like the wake-up call for me with Christianity, was being like, holy shit, this crazy ass narrative is actually true. It's not just like symbolic and shit, it's like actually real. But my assertion would be it is, right? And our inability to understand that is sort of ephemeral. Just like if you were to not know a tiger exists, you're walking through the woods, you see a tiger. I mean, suddenly that's in your scenario. You never knew it was even a thing.
I would like to provide a counter narrative to that in the sense of understanding. So when it comes to what is, sure, you accept, you read, you observe, you see something. There's a fact, either through senses or through instrumental observation. There's some facts, but you don't understand it yet. You can theorize and you can test, and if you test and if your theory is correct, then perhaps you can move forward towards the truth. But the thing is, until you understand, you don't even know what is. It's just like you know there is something there, but without understanding, even that is incomplete. It's just knowledge of existence, period. But the defining parameters of what that thing existing is unknown. And I think it's very important to seek and figure out what that is. So I'm not saying that, you know, I'm not denying what is. I am simply trying to understand if there is a rationale behind it. Now, I may not understand it, but I will still attempt to understand it. That is all.
Well, sure, and let me give you a few plausible scenarios, right? I mean, or at least thought experiments of why something like Archons could make sense. I mean, this is getting a little off the original topic, but the essential concept is just that they are some kind of psychic parasites who derive some kind of gratitude or satisfaction from things like human emotions, or even things like the spilling of blood or the taking of life. And that's actually an extremely ancient belief that humans have had all over the world, that there's some kind of spiritual entities that take sustenance from human sacrifice and blood sacrifice. which happens all over the world, as well as, other things too. And I don't think that's actually any logical theory, right? I mean, if you believe there could be such things as, extra dimensional beings, things that maybe exist on other vibrations or frequencies or in some other essence, like what we would call spirits, I don't think that's an irrational position, given that we know there's like 12 dimensions of space-time or whatever, and nobody really knows what the hell's going on with all the things, so I don't know. I could see as some kind of sadistic or parasitic species in that sense making sense. And also we should remember the Matrix is literally a Gnostic parable. Like the Matrix is literally consciously is the Gnostic doctrine. And so in the Matrix, all the people live in this illusionary dream world that they're trapped in, just like we're trapped in this Gnostic maze of the Archons, the Black Iron Prison, like NSA said. And they're just, somehow using us for energy, right? Like our souls. Imagine our souls were containing energy. If they can keep the energy of our souls trapped in an infinite closed system and then somehow feed off our emotions, I don't know. That seems somewhat plausible to me.
I'm sorry. I know I'm kind of taking over, and I'm sorry. I ended after this. I just want to propose a potential confusion about sacrifice. Maybe this is a confusion. The idea of like burning something or killing something to achieve something, or sacrifice something to get something, I believe is a very primitive misunderstanding of what sacrifice really is. When we want to achieve something, we sacrifice, right? We work hard. That is sacrifice. Destruction is not sacrifice. Burning something is not sacrifice. Losing something necessarily is not sacrifice. Sacrifice is devoting energy and time towards something to achieve something. That is real sacrifice. Sacrificing your life for your children, for example, for their future. That is sacrifice, and that brings about good and power. So from sacrifice, power can be gained. But I think this is a very primitive magical thinking misunderstanding that sacrifice means, putting someone on a, whatever and burning them alive or something, and some deity is satisfied. I think that's just a magical anthropomorphization of these ideas that in reality, it does actually take sacrifice for improvement. We have to do experiments. We sent monkeys to space and they have to die. Sacrifices for progress.
That is so tangential, dude. I was using the term sacrifice to refer in the linguistic use of the word sacrifice, which actually does originally and primarily mean sacrificing, like food, animals, or people, or whatever to God. That's the original meaning. Sacrificing, when you say like I sacrificed so much to get that job, that word actually derives from the religious concept, which came first and is the primary definer of the term. So yes, there is a colloquial meaning of sacrifice that's different, but the point is I was using it in precisely that magical way because we're talking about religion. And anyways, it's just kind of a tangent. The point is I was talking about the other kind. The kind that you're not talking about was the kind I was talking about. Blood sacrifice, right? I'm talking about people killing animals, killing babies, killing people, because that's happened for thousands of years and still happens to this day all over the world. And my point is, there's a universal belief in all these different cultures that there are invisible entities who are driving sustenance from human sacrifice, blood sacrifice, animal sacrifice, incense sacrifice, food sacrifice, and all these different things. I don't think it's unreasonable to say that the reason that custom is universal is because it is actually in some sense efficacious, because there are actually entities that interface with people through psychic or telepathic means. And I think that should be particularly not hard to understand for people who use DMT or who are familiar with that whole realm of the entities that are found there and so forth, right? I think everybody should be agnostic about the reality of those beings until the science is much more advanced than it is. Because right now, anyone who tells you there aren't such entities is not speaking from a scientific point of view. That would be a faith position.
Well, look at what's going on as a type of alien lacrosse, sort of, or proxy war, where essentially they can settle disputes between them without going into direct war by engaging in this type of warfare between humans as proxies.
So I just want to say, I think we should probably wrap up the podcast because this is quite a long one, and I don't think it's probably at the upper limit of how long it should be, but then we're kind of going off the topic.
Yeah, you're
but
right.
This very interesting. and we can always do another episode. There's so many more. I mean, I'm going to read all the Gnostic Gospels and all the Nag Hammadi, and so we can have a series hopefully on this. I'd also love to get Doug in because he's neck deep in the Gnostic stuff.
That was a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kashika. Thank you, Crimson. Appreciate it. It was very good. Thanks everyone for coming and for your questions and participation. We're just going to jump up to one of the other rooms. Sorry. You can find this on the Roundtable Discord server on YouTube and BitChute Roundtable Podcast. Thank you very much. God bless. I'm going to jump to video chat.